It all started with a promise to bring back American jobs, to make American manufacturing great again. The year was 2018, and the US-China trade war was no longer just a distant policy debate, it was about to reshape the global economy. At first, it seemed like a bold but simple plan: raise tariffs on Chinese goods, make them more expensive, and push American companies to bring production back home. The Trump administration rolled out wave after wave of tariffs, starting small, 10%, then 25%. But then, as tensions escalated, so did the numbers of Semiconductors, 50%, 75%, until one day the White House dropped a bombshell: 125% tariffs on key Chinese imports. The response from Beijing? Equally aggressive, 84% retaliatory tariffs on American goods. A clear message that China was ready to fight back. But what exactly was being taxed? And more importantly, who was really paying the price? On the surface, the targets were strategic: electronics, steel, machinery industries that symbolized economic strength. For China, the goal was clear: put pressure on U.S. farmers, a key voting bloc in America's heartland. Soybeans, pork, dairy, all suddenly trapped in a high-stakes geopolitical game. At first, the headlines painted a picture of victory. Tariffs will revive U.S. manufacturing. America first. But as the months passed, reality set in. Instead of making things cheaper, costs skyrocketed. Instead of revitalizing factories, supply chains broke down. American companies faced a tough choice: absorb the costs or pass them on to consumers. And so, for millions of everyday Americans, the trade war wasn't just about policy. It was about the price of groceries, the cost of a new iPhone, the rising bills on farm equipment. The question wasn't just whether tariffs could hurt China. It was whether America was hurting itself in the process. And that's where the real story begins. What happens when two of the world's largest economies don't just clash on trade, but drag the entire global system into the ring with them? Not long after the tariffs started flying, China made its move. It filed a formal complaint with the World Trade Organization. The message was clear: the U.S. was violating international trade rules. But Beijing didn't just argue about technicalities. It framed the issue around something much bigger: development rights. According to China, these tariffs weren't just unfair, they were an attempt to block its rise as a modern economy. They said, in effect, we have a right to develop. We're still a developing nation, and this kind of pressure breaks the rules we all agreed on. Now here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't the first time the WTO had to step into a US-China dispute. In fact, since China joined the WTO in 2001, the two countries have clashed over 30 times in formal disputes. Sometimes China won, other times the US did, but each case chipped away at the trust both sides had in the system. Then came a stark warning. In 2020, the WTO estimated that ongoing trade tensions could cause up to an 80% decline in global trade growth. Let that sink in, 80%. That's not just a slowdown, it's an unraveling. But here's the twist. The US didn't just brush off China's claims. It began openly questioning the credibility of the WTO itself. Washington argued the system was outdated, too slow, and even biased in favor of countries like China that game the rules. The Trump administration blocked the appointment of new WTO judges. It even threatened to withdraw from the system altogether. And here's where I want to pause, because honestly, I get the frustration. It does feel like the rules haven't kept up with today's realities. And yes, China's rapid growth and state-driven model challenged the assumptions many Western economies were built on. But walking away from multilateral institutions? That's a dangerous game. When the US distances itself from global frameworks, it doesn't just hurt its rivals, it weakens its own influence and opens the door for others, like China, to reshape those rules in their favor. So the real question becomes, is this about sovereignty or strategy? Do we abandon the field because we don't like the ref? Or do we double down, reform the rules, and lead by example? Either way, the game isn't just economic anymore. It's geopolitical. It's about who sets the rules of the future. And speaking of the future, that brings us to the next battleground, one hidden beneath the earth, yet powering every screen we touch. What if I told you that while Washington debates tariffs and trade deficits, Beijing is already playing its next move, 5 steps ahead? While the U.S. media speculates about a possible Trump comeback, China is quietly preparing, not with panic, but with precision. Think about it. In the chessboard of global strategy, China isn't reacting emotionally to Trump's rhetoric. Instead, it's adapting its long game. From expanding rare earth production to courting Silicon Valley giants, Beijing is working behind the scenes to turn potential threats into opportunities. Take Elon Musk, for example. Tesla's Shanghai Gigafactory, built in record time, wasn't just a business deal, it was a signal. China offered favorable loans, fast-track permits, and full ownership rights in a market where foreign car makers usually need a local partner. Why? Because Beijing knew what it was doing. By partnering with the world's most influential tech entrepreneur, China didn't just bring in investment, it gained influence in the future of electric vehicles. Now contrast that with Trump's hardline stance on China. The tariffs, the tech bans, the trade war. It might look tough on the surface, but here's where we need a reality check. While Trump pushed companies to decouple from China, many multinationals quietly doubled down on their China presence, afraid to lose market share. Even Elon himself praised China's efficiency more than once. This reveals something deeper. When the U.S. steps back from global leadership, like pulling out of trade pacts or questioning climate deals, China doesn't just watch, it fills the vacuum. Beijing sees every American withdrawal as an opening. When the U.S. hesitated on 5G infrastructure, China's Huawei stepped up. When America paused on global development lending, China expanded its Belt and Road Initiative. Every hesitation becomes an invitation. And let's talk about resources. China isn't just stockpiling influence. It's securing control over rare earth elements, the raw materials critical to making everything from smartphones to fighter jets. Today, China controls more than 80% of global rare earth processing capacity. It's no accident, it's strategy. While the world slept on supply chains, Beijing built a chokehold. And honestly, that worries me, because power in the 21st century isn't just about armies or borders anymore. It's about who controls the technology and who controls the resources that technology depends on. So while America debates its next election, China is laying tracks for the next decade. And that brings us to a harsh but necessary question. What happens if China decides to weaponize this control? How fragile is America's tech future, really? Let's explore that next. Let me ask you something. What happens when two giants clash, but the smaller nations standing between them have everything to lose? This isn't just a US-China story anymore. It's also about allies, Japan, South Korea, the EU, and even rising players like India and ASEAN, who now find themselves caught in a geopolitical crossfire they never asked for. Let's start with Japan and South Korea. Both are long-standing US allies. Both are deeply integrated into China's supply chain. And both know that upsetting either side could come at a steep price. Remember the THAAD missile defense system controversy back in 2017? When South Korea agreed to host a US anti-missile system, China responded almost instantly. K-pop concerts were canceled, Korean products were quietly removed from Chinese shelves, and the tourism industry took a brutal hit. That wasn't just a policy dispute, that was a warning shot. A reminder that for smaller nations, aligning too closely with Washington can spark Beijing's economic retaliation. Now zoom out to Europe. The European Union often walks a tightrope, talking tough on human rights and fair trade with China, while still relying on Beijing as one of its top trading partners. Look at Germany, for instance. Its economy leans heavily on auto exports, many of which head straight to China. So even as Berlin raises concerns about Chinese overcapacity and industrial subsidies, it treads carefully, because losing access to that market would be economically devastating. This balancing act creates an awkward reality. Allies like the EU support America's principles, but they can't always afford to support its tactics. And what about alternatives to the US market from China's perspective? Some say China could turn to ASEAN, India, or even Mexico to offset losses from U.S. tariffs. But let's be honest, that's easier said than done. ASEAN is growing fast, but it's a fragmented region with varying policies and infrastructure challenges. India has massive potential, but it still struggles with regulatory bottlenecks, logistics inefficiencies, and a deeply protective market. In Mexico, it's more of a manufacturing partner for North America than a major consumer market for Chinese goods. In short, there's no easy substitute for access to the American consumer. From my perspective, this is where the trade war's ripple effects become most personal, because they don't just affect the two countries at the top. They shape the choices, fears, and futures of entire regions caught in between. And maybe that's the most underestimated piece of this puzzle. How long can allies stay neutral before they're forced to choose a side? And speaking of choosing sides, what happens if China decides to draw a line in the sand? With the very materials the world needs most, let's talk about rare earths. Have you ever held something in your hand that quietly holds the power to shift the global balance? Chances are you already have. It might have been a smartphone, an electric vehicle key fob, or even noise-canceling earbuds. Inside all of them are ingredients so rare, so vital, that they've become central to modern life. Yet few of us know their names. They're called rare earths. Despite the name, they're not all that rare in nature. But processing them, that's a whole different story. These 17 chemically similar elements are critical for everything from wind turbines and EV batteries to advanced military tech like the F-35 fighter jet. Let me give you a quick snapshot. Neodymium and praseodymium help power magnets and electric motors. Dysprosium improves their performance under high heat. Yttrium, used in lasers, sensors, and targeting systems. In total, 7 rare earths have recently been placed under export restrictions by China, directly affecting U.S. sectors ranging from clean energy to defense. And here's the kicker. China controls nearly 99% of the world's heavy rare earth processing. Now, how did we end up in this position? China didn't just stumble into dominance. It was a deliberate, decades-long strategy, heavily subsidizing mining, tolerating environmental costs others wouldn't, and cornering the market when other countries backed away due to regulations and cost. From a pure business standpoint, it was brilliant. From a national security lens, it's a ticking time bomb. The U.S. has rare earth deposits, but extracting and processing them comes with serious environmental risks. Toxic waste, radioactive byproducts, plus local opposition, legal red tape, and lack of infrastructure make it a slow, uphill climb. Take the Mountain Pass mine in California. It's the only rare earth facility in the U.S. It shut down in 2002, reopened in 2012, and now sends its ore right back to China for processing. Crazy, right? To me, this is one of the most overlooked national vulnerabilities we face. We often think of war in terms of tanks or tariffs, but sometimes it's the supply chain, the invisible threads that hold an economy together, that determine who wins. And the rare earth story isn't just about materials. It's about leverage. And right now, China holds most of it. So the question is, how will the U.S. respond? Well, that takes us to the final chapter of this escalating drama. Because just as China sharpens its tools, the U.S. is quietly rewriting its own playbook. What if the future of American power depends not just on rockets and AI, but on whether we can dig fast enough? It sounds dramatic, but let's talk reality. After years of warnings, the U.S. has finally started racing to secure its own rare earth supply. Places like Mountain Pass in California and proposed sites in Texas are being called the next front lines of critical mineral independence. But here's the thing, progress has been painfully slow. Why? Well, it's a mix of bureaucratic delays, local resistance, and frankly, a lack of urgency until recently. Back in 2010, when China first restricted rare earth exports to Japan, the U.S. had a chance to react boldly. Instead, we got distracted by partisan fights, by economic optimism, and by the flawed belief that globalization would keep things smooth. Now we're playing catch-up, and time's not on our side. But here's something people often miss. America doesn't have to go it alone. Countries like Australia, Vietnam, and even Ukraine have rare earth potential. Australia, for instance, is already producing and exporting rare earths to global markets. Vietnam holds the world's second largest reserves. Sounds promising, right? Yes and no. Because it's not just about digging up the elements, it's about having the facilities to refine them. And in that game, China still holds nearly all the cards. That's why the US is exploring a third option. One I find particularly exciting: recycling. Imagine recovering rare earths from old smartphones, wind turbines, EV batteries, even military tech. Instead of tossing them in landfills, we could mine our own trash. Sounds futuristic? It's already happening on a small scale. The Department of Energy is funding programs to reclaim rare earths from e-waste, and companies like Urban Mining Co. in Texas are showing early promise. To me, this is one of the smartest long-term bets we can make. It's cleaner, it's faster, and it turns a liability, our growing tech waste, into a strategic asset. But let's be honest, this isn't going to solve everything overnight. The scale of what's needed is massive, and while progress is happening, it's a race against time. So where does that leave us? Because while America scrambles to build, China's not waiting. It's expanding partnerships, locking in deals, and perfecting the art of quiet dominance. In our final chapter, we'll look at the bigger picture, how all these pieces connect, and what this rare earth rivalry means for everyday people like you and me. What if the world's smartest devices are being powered by one of the world's riskiest relationships? At the heart of this rare earth rivalry lies a deep, sometimes uncomfortable truth. The US and China are profoundly interdependent. On one hand, America fuels global demand with its insatiable appetite for EVs, smartphones, advanced weaponry, and clean energy tech. On the other, China supplies the raw materials, especially rare earth elements, that make this technology even possible. It's a fragile dance, and the music's getting faster. Because as both nations ramp up nationalism and economic decoupling, we're left wondering, what happens if the music stops? Let's imagine full decoupling for a moment. No Chinese rare earths to the US, no American semiconductors or design software to China. Would that spark a new age of innovation, each side racing to outcreate the other? Or would it lead to tech stagnation, soaring costs, and global disruption? Honestly, it could be both. The 2018-2020 trade war gave us a sneak peek. Tariffs were imposed. Supply chains rattled. But something fascinating happened. China doubled down on resource control, and the US began realizing how dependent it had become. Not just on cheap labor, but on deep strategic materials. In that round, many would argue China played the long game better. They used export restrictions, targeted US agriculture to pressure politically sensitive states, and expanded influence in Africa and Latin America quietly and effectively. Meanwhile, American businesses scrambled. Some adapted, others just waited it out. To me, the biggest takeaway from that era wasn't who won, it's that neither side truly gained lasting security. They both exposed their own vulnerabilities. So what now? Are we ready for a full-blown resource war in the 21st century? Not a war with bombs and tanks, but one fought through supply chains, minerals, and patents? Honestly, I don't think we are. Not yet, but we can be. It starts with awareness, with investing in innovation, yes, but also in relationships, resilience, and responsibility. Because rare earths aren't just about metals, they're about vision. Do we see the world as a zero-sum game, or as a complex system that we either manage or break? As we close this journey, I hope you walk away not just more informed, but more awake to how our everyday tech is tied to invisible forces that shape our world, and to the idea that maybe, just maybe, the future is still ours to design. Let's make it a smart one. So let's take a step back and reflect. Over the past few minutes, we've uncovered how rare earths, these invisible elements buried deep in the earth, are silently shaping the future of technology, economics, and even global power. We explored how China quietly built dominance, how America is racing against time to catch up, and how our allies and supply chains are caught in the middle. We saw that this isn't just about minerals or trade, it's about control, innovation, and the kind of world we want to live in. Now here's the big question for you. What role do you play in this? Because while most of us won't be mining in California or designing military tech, we're still part of this story. Every time we buy a phone, drive an EV, or vote for leaders who shape economic policy. Ask yourself, are we thinking long-term when it comes to sustainability and security? Are we building the resilience to adapt in a world where tech and power are deeply entangled? If this video helped you see these issues more clearly, if it sparked a new question or made you pause and think, then I invite you to keep this conversation going. Like this video if it gave you value. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. And in the comments, tell me, do you think a full decoupling is coming? Or is interdependence too deeply wired in? Your voice matters because in a world where rare earths shape rare opportunities, clarity is power. Let's stay curious, stay informed, and shape the future together.